think.
I think we'll be good. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christine Wagner. I'm Vice Provost and Dean of the Graduate School, and I want to thank you so much for having us here today. Thank you for including us in one of your meetings. We very much appreciate the opportunity. And as you all know, having been at UAlbany for a long time, probably, the University of Albany strives to invest in innovation, public service, and community partnerships. And through a grant program at UAlbany called the Strategic Allocation of Resources, or STAR grant program, the university agreed to support 17 different proposals for this academic year 25-26. And these projects that were funded reflect the best of UAlbany academic experience, cutting edge research, and a strong commitment to addressing real world challenges. And the graduate school was lucky enough to get one of these proposals. We presented a program in a proposal called Share the Knowledge, a program for doctoral student public engagement. And we did this proposal with the mindset that every day our UAlbany doctoral students are producing research that has real potential to influence and help our local communities and the public. And yet a lot of times their dissertation research is sort of stays at UAlbany, their dissertation committees hear it, and the public is not aware of the great things they're doing that really could have an impact in everyday life. And so through this Share the Knowledge program, we had 26 doctoral students from across many different disciplines on campus. As part of this grant program, we had funding so that these students could complete an 8-week training program. We had faculty mentors who worked with them for this whole 8 weeks. And they also engaged in 2 programs. They engaged in the Alan Alda Center for Scientific Communication at Stony Brook, and they also engaged with a certified Gallup strengths coach from Cornell University as part of their training. And the training was to basically help them with their communication to be able to take the complex dissertation work that they've done, which is huge in scope and breadth, and speak for 10 minutes to a public audience, which is a challenge for sure. So they learned a lot over the course of this 8-week program for sure. And so, like I said, there were 26 doctoral scholars who engaged in this program. Today, you'll be hearing from just 3 of them across very different disciplines. Each scholar is going to speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll follow that with about a 5-minute question and answer period. We'll probably just try to keep it going for time's sake. I would ask that you just hold your questions to the end of their presentation because we are timing them and holding up a 2-minute left, and I don't want to throw them off their game. But we'll have time between presentations for questions, and then of course at the end it's up to you and your schedule. I'm sure they would be available to take more questions then. So again, thank you so much for coming, and thanks for inviting us and giving the students this opportunity. So our first presenter, and I'll just say this too, I'm going to say the student's name, but they're going to come up and tell you what program they're in, maybe what year they're in, and the title of their dissertation presentation. So first up, we have Jessica Palmatier.
Thanks, Dr. Wagner. Right. Figure out this tech here a little bit. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Jessica Palmatier. I'm a 4th-year PhD candidate at University of Albany. I'm in the history department. My dissertation is titled No Place for a Woman. So my topic is female Vietnam War veterans. And also civilian volunteers, female volunteers in the Vietnam War. This topic was of interest to me because I feel like women were sort of underrepresented in the war lexicon. You don't really hear about women too much when you hear about the Vietnam War, so it's very interesting to me. I think that when we talk about women in the war, we think about sort of the way that the war has affected them. We have sort of a multi-pronged approach. We have, on one hand, women who have experienced sort of mental health challenges, PTSD, for instance, and then the other hand, some physical health challenges from their war experience. So they come back to the United States, try to get services, and sort of experience roadblocks. Then we have 50 years later, women in the United States who are also experiencing challenges in getting healthcare, whether it be mental or physical healthcare. And so my research sort of details how do we repair these issues in the healthcare system and what are we doing in this healthcare system in the United States? Um, I come at my research from a very personal standpoint. I states who lives with medically diagnosed complex PTSD. Um, so my historical methodology process was kind of interesting. I went pretty deep into the archives. I did a lot of like oral history research into two groups of women, specifically combat nurses and donut dollies, which I'll talk about in a minute. And did some work in the National Archives, also Library of Congress, and very much into Texas Tech. They have the Sam Johnson Vietnam Archive. On the scientific side, did a lot of work in scientific journals, American Journal of Epidemiology, U.S. government studies, Duke University, those type of larger scientific research type studies. I do want to make it very clear that I'm a historian that conducts this research. I'm not a scientist, not in the medical field. Did want to make that very clear. So these two groups of women that I focus on, combat nurses and donut dollies, that's a colloquial name for the SRAO, Red Cross volunteers. Um, These two groups specifically that I focused on, I do want to make it very clear, though, that there were many groups of women that served in the Vietnam War. These are just two that I chose to focus on. And the reason being, these were two groups of women that served men and paid an enormous personal cost for this. Nurses specifically physically served men in their nursing care, emotionally too, in some ways, certainly. Donut dollies were women who were in a long line of entertainment workers in wartime. However, they ended up serving men emotionally as well. So these two groups of women experienced a lot of trauma. Referred combat trauma, certainly. This is something that happens in a wartime setting with the nurses. You see this a lot in treating terrible battlefield injuries, proximity to the battlefield. With donut dollies, listening to the experiences when they speak to the soldiers. Military sexual trauma, or MST, we see this a lot. Sexual violence, sexual harassment, rape. Both groups experience this. Physical harm. Both of these women groups were under constant threat of danger, violence, mortar attacks, rockets, bombings, death of their friends, co-workers, romantic partners. Women also experienced physical ailments when they came home from the war. Now, many of these women talked about being exposed to Agent Orange. We don't have specific studies that were done on female veterans of the war. We do have male veterans, not females. I actually just finished up my Agent Orange chapter. I did some tangential research on women who were exposed to herbicides and linked that. But so we have women who were exposed to Agent Orange, or so they have reported. We have higher cancer rates, pancreatic cancer, brain cancer, breast cancer, especially in combat nurses, reproductive issues, stillbirths, miscarriages, many different birth defects. This one's interesting. Higher risk of motor vehicle fatalities. So this happened with male veterans as well. Veterans would be in a state of heightened arousal, heightened emotional arousal in Vietnam. And when they came home, they were trying to sort of chase that dopamine high and would drive too fast, would make mistakes on the road, take corners too fast, and get into terrible accidents. So when these veterans returned to America and tried to maybe seek some sort of health care, physical, mental, etc., they sort of came up against some roadblocks. They were not excluded technically from the VA, but they were excluded culturally. And by that, I mean, when the women tried to enter the VA, if a nurse tried to enter a VA, the men would tell them to leave. PTSD, not included in the DSM-3, back then it was the 3, not included until 1980. So if the veterans were coming back 60s, late 60s, early 70s, it wasn't even included until the 80s. So as a culture, we didn't really understand PTSD yet. Lack of access. Women reported a lack of access to gynecological care. The VA was where they were getting their medical care. And they were hesitant to seek help because of societal negative response to the war. So 50 years later, after the fall of Saigon, I argue we still have some issues in the healthcare system, some iniquity when it comes to women, a knowledge gap. Since, oh boy, I'm not talking fast enough. Before 1993, women of childbearing age were not included in medical studies. So we have a dearth of medical research that included women's bodies. So we don't know how medicines affect women's bodies. We don't understand women's bodies medically. Reproductive challenges. We have maternity health care deserts where women can't get obstetrical care. We have the overturning of Roe v. Wade, where women can't get abortion care. Dismissal by the medical community. Women are reporting that they are not getting listened to by doctors and nurses in the medical community. Marginalized groups, women of color, women in the LGBTQ community are reporting these issues at a higher rate. How do we repair this? Well, I'm saying we should do more training. How do we talk to women? How do we listen to women medically in a medical community? I think we should include more women in clinical trials. It's getting better, but it's still not there yet. Vote. Vote to maintain our safeguards that we already have, and vote to support increases in funding and diversify the medical field. Hire more women in the medical field. Hire more women in medical editing, medical writing. Now, these charts, just briefly, you can see the orange bar. That's women's health research from 2013 to 2023. This came from the National Institutes of Health. So this is women's, and this is other, this gray. So you can see the disparity. This is spending on the top, and this is grants on the bottom. Pretty similar there. I appreciate it, and I made it on time. It's my sources, in case you're interested in some of the sources that I use, just a few sources. If you were to contact me, I could give you more if you're interested, but.
We can take a couple of questions now if there are any, and then so more later.
Yes.
I have so many questions.
I would love, yes.
First of all, why the Vietnam veteran female? Why did you choose them? And when they went to get help, you said they were turned away. Like, why?
So the first part. So Vietnam's always interested me, like really since I was young. I am a child of the 80s, so I think like just proximity in time is part of it, like because I wasn't that far away in time, just age-wise, probably. So like I was hearing a little bit about the war when I was growing up. So I think that's part of it, like just media too. But so yes, I've always been very interested in Vietnam and just like the time period. As far as the women who were being turned away, they were being turned away from the VA, from the men, the male veterans who were already at the VA, being like grouped together, doing rap groups, etc. They call them rap groups when they're just sort of casually, I would call it like a casual hangout, but they were casually together, the male veterans, the women were turned away by the male veterans socially. So again, they're not technically excluded. They're allowed to be there because especially the nurses were considered veterans. They were allowed to be there, but they were turned away socially. Yeah.
Can I ask you one more question?
Of course.
You are in your 4th year
Yes.
of your doctoral. Has your hypotheses, has anything changed since one administration was there when you started and another one has since taken place that doesn't really seem to value female veterans?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I don't know that like specifically I've changed my thinking, but I've had a lot of like small changes. Like the Agent, I just finished my Agent Orange chapter I just sent it in for my first round of edits. And I think like small changes in the way that I think as I'm coming across new information. But because my research is like historically based, a lot of that stuff doesn't change. It's so that piece of it is, it's just what I'm learning from. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I know your papers on Vietnam, but in your research, did you come across anything after World War II with similar type of impacts?
Can you?
Well, there were nurses in World War II. They came out and had many, I assume, of the same issues that you're seeing here. Did you come across anything that someone identified this as an issue back then and nothing happened, or ignored, or just never came up?
That's a really good question. I think I've seen more ties that I could like make connections with Korea than I would with World War II.
Okay.
Because some of the nurses that I've like listened to their oral histories, some of them were in Korea and in Vietnam. So I think like more connections I can make easily between the Korean War and Vietnam War. Although interestingly, and this is like, I could take forever talking, right? But interestingly, my first dissertation topic was the Cold War, and I changed my topic. So, I mean, it's interesting. You can make a lot of connections between that World War II. I consider myself a gender and military historian. So I make a lot of like gender connections within Cold War stuff, so yeah.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to the next presentation, but I'm sure.
Thank you. Yes. I'm sorry for my rudeness. I have to leave because I have to teach a college class. I'm sorry.
Well, allow it. Okay, our next speaker is Molly Bray Hayes. Thanks. Just introduce yourself and your program.
Hello, everyone. My name is Molly Bray Hayes. I am technically a 3rd-year PhD candidate now, and I'm at the School of Social Welfare. And I planned for 10 to 15 minutes, but I'm going to try and talk fast. So we'll see how this goes. And also thank you all for being here. My title of this presentation is Reimagining Dementia in Qualitative Research. There's a lot that's missing. I'm going to begin today with a quote from a person who lives with dementia that I had the privilege of having a conversation with. She said, regardless of how much experience you have working with or living with people with some kind of cognitive change, there's a lot that's missing that I'm experiencing or that we're experiencing that is not obvious to people. Just to kind of orient us, I'll give a little bit on the background of my topic and my positionality as a social researcher. So in America, we have a generation of baby boomers who are aging. The number one cause of a dementia diagnosis is increased life expectancy. So in our country, as we have aging older adults, we also have an increase of individuals living with cognitive changes. And that's expected to continue to grow over the next couple of decades. That being said, most people, maybe in this room, have had some familiarity with someone who lives with cognitive changes. For example, this is a picture of me with my mother, Una Bray. She lived with Alzheimer's disease from 2013 to 2019. And I was able to be one of her caregivers when I was in my 20s. At that time, I was an art student and an artist. That's my background personally, before I came to UAlbany. What I found in my experience with my mother is I was able to go through the very hard parts of dementia as a caregiver. Living with cognitive changes is not only very difficult for the individual experiencing them, it's difficult for everyone who cares about that person. And that can be in social circumstances, that can be economic, emotional, the list goes on. What I found was bringing my creative part of myself as an artist to my experience with my mother was able to kind of provide these moments of connection and joy and in the moment kind of creativity we could share together. What was interesting to me when I started my PhD program is I found that within the scientific literature, that's starting to be supported as being an increaser of well-being for people living with dementia, this kind of in-the-moment co-creation that can occur. Dementia itself is a highly stigmatized illness. Stigma is historically defined as a process based on the social construction of identity. Now, stigmas associated with a dementia diagnosis not only dictate the way individuals are valued within all the social structures they exist in, but it also widely perpetuates this notion that they're unable to contribute or even engage in discourse around their own experience. Now, this stigma, it can color every aspect of a person's experience who lives with dementia. Not only that, it can kind of extend to these other areas of being, whether it's in care design for people who live with dementia, or even social research for people who live with dementia. Now, I want to introduce a little bit of a counter narrative to the stigma that surrounds dementia, which is dementia positivity. Dementia positivity is an inclusive, empowering, human rights-based framework that's being increasingly embraced in a lot of models of care for people living with dementia. Some people might be familiar, and it's one of the more well-known care models, Hodgwick, which is a residential place for people living with dementia in the Netherlands. And what Hodgwick did in terms of dementia positive care design is they moved away from this kind of medical model, the one that we see here in the US, where our nursing homes or memory care units are kind of set up like a hospital wing, with one hallway and patients' rooms on either side. What Hodgwick did is it made this dementia village, which really kind of represents a real community like we have here in Albany. It has nuclear kind of households that people living with dementia can live in, and they can be placed there with other folks who have common interests. They can go to places like the Hodgwick General Store, where they can exchange money, and buy produce there. And they can really still practice autonomy, and have the choices that any of us would want to have while navigating a dementia diagnosis. So these care designs are being embraced in Europe, Canada. They're slowly making their way to the US in terms of residential care design. What I'm interested in is bridging this kind of dementia positivity from care for people living with dementia into the social research that we do for them. Just a little background on qualitative research. What is that? Qualitative research aims to explore lived experiences. So most qualitative methods use a lot of verbal data, like the quotes I've been showing today. That's historically where social researchers will understand the lived experience of their participants through interviews or note-taking. Because of the changes that occur in the brain of someone who's living with dementia, that might not be an accessible way for them to communicate with researchers. Neuroscience shows that, especially with Alzheimer's disease, the first parts of the brain that are affected are going to be the language and speech center, as well as the memory center. But what is really cool and surprising is the creative center of the brain is usually not as affected by, say, the plaque buildup associated with Alzheimer's disease. I'm sure a lot of you have seen music therapy with people living with dementia, and it can be a very powerful example of this. I'm going to try and hurry up. Okay. Just moving forward, this top quote is from the Disabilities Rights Movement, nothing about us without us. Any participants who are having social research done for their population want to be involved in that. And just another kind of perspective that says it better than I could from a person who's living with dementia. She says, my perspective is that all social research having to do with dementia should be shared, created by, and have a participant with cognitive change. I think that's really important because I think the social research needs to really focus on what we need. And all good intentions aside, people with lived experience are unique in the fact that we're living with it and that we know what we need. And I think we're more apt to be able to help design something that would be more meaningful to us. Again, she said it better than I could. Just to kind of sum up here, where my PhD research comes in is I'm looking to marry arts-based research with qualitative research for people who are living with dementia. Arts-based research has been widely used with a lot of marginalized populations that might not have comfortability or access to more traditional modes of communication with researchers. It's been well used within the disabilities rights kind of movement and research that's been done in that space. I'm looking to extend that even more so than's already happening into working with people living with dementia. Now, this could include painting, drawing, any form of creative expression really that's accessible to the individual. Arts-based research really kind of explores the invisible. You know, it creates this site of surprise, and it can also really connect human beings to one another, researcher to participants to audience, you know. It's about sharing and finding what's beyond qualitative or quantitative data and can really capture kind of the essence of lived experience that's not quite captured with traditional methodologies. I just wanted to end with this portrait that was made by a gentleman who lives with dementia. And just to say what he said about this portrait. He said, this painting was done shortly after I was diagnosed and was a bit confused about things. Now, I don't know about you all, but looking at this, I kind of get that without even hearing that quote. Just from kind of the furrowed brow of his expression, you know, these kind of swirls that are coming out from his mind space. These kind of patterns that don't seem to be quite landing if they're foreground or background. And that's just kind of a brief example of the power of art to express a lived experience of someone in a very accessible way for a population that is underrepresented within qualitative research. So that's what I'm doing at UAlbany, and thank you all for your time.
You can say.
Oh, right. Questions. So sorry, I'm like done.
For now, the questions come out.
Yes, please.
Well, Deb and I are taking one of these lifelong learning courses.
Yeah.
On the blue zones, how people
Mm.
learn to live longer, hope to be in that group. Question for you, you said that your, the research is coming to the US, the model of this art.
Mhm.
In your research, does a person, are they more responsive if they're in a group where they have that community base, or when they're by themselves with an art therapist of some kind?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that both have benefits. For me, I think, we hear a lot about the effect of social isolation. And so for me, with any arts-based work, especially with people who are living with dementia that kind of already experience this real social stigma and isolation, it's very powerful to do it in a group setting. And I think if that's ever available, that's always a really beneficial option. Yeah. And it's been really well supported to increase well-being, to even improve cognition, especially with kind of social engagement. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Leslie.
you.
Thank you. I'm not familiar. How do you get it on slideshow? Okay, perfect. All right, our next speaker is Hyoshin Key. And if you would again introduce yourself in terms of your program and all of that. Wait.
So, hello everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm a fourth year PhD student in economics. So this project, I'm doing I'm a applied microeconomics with focus on the health and public economics. And this project is the co-work with one of my friend who is Hyunwoo Do. He's also a fifth year PhD student in economics. So let's start. So today I'll talk about mental health and behavior responses to natural disasters, which you might already heard about. So we know that natural disasters are becoming more frequent and severe with an increasing economic and human cost. So, for example, billion-dollar disasters, which means disaster that occurred $1 billion damage, was 3.3 in 1980s, but now it's 13. So, and also the interval between those disasters has fallen from 82 days to 18 days. So it's becoming really frequent and severe. But we know that economic consequences such as economic growth, labor market outcomes, educational outcomes, and individual health outcomes, physical health outcomes, mental health outcomes of natural disasters have been quite extensively studied, right? So what's new? What's new, right? What is my contribution is, first of all, most of the previous studies focus on the case studies, which means one disaster at a time. And then I think it might be better if we can generalize this. So our first contribution is we pulled all the disaster together to estimate the average effect of a disaster on the mental health. And then we also explore the heterogeneity by individual characteristics. Secondly, most of the researchers ignore the repeated hits. So this might be important, especially in a mental health literature, because mental health, as Jessica who left, she said, PTSD takes time, and then mental health takes time to recover. So it might be two ways actually. Second shock could effectively amplify, which means exacerbate the first one, because after the first one, they might not be fully recovered, and then they got hit for the second one. The second one impact might be larger, right? But on the other hand, it could be less impactful if people have already adapted to the first shock. We call it as a habituation. So we model the compound exposure to the natural disasters. So the brief example for the sensitization, which is the amplifying the second one. So this is something like this. So there were 4 federal disaster declarations in 5 years in Houston. 2015, they have a big flood. 16, they have a big flood again. And then 17, we all know they have Harvey, which was a big one. And then 19, they already have and then they again have a tropical storm. So question 1 would be, would Tropical Storm Imelda have the same impact on the mental health if they do not have a Harvey or not, right? So this is unclear. And the second one is, remember Sandy, right? Sandy was a big one, and it was quite unexpected to make that much damages. But Florida also receives hurricanes almost every year, and they're all big as well. But would Hurricane Sandy have had a less impact in New York for mental health in New Yorkers if they were routinely exposed to the hurricanes as Florida? So they have 2 different aspects, and our research is focusing on which impact might be larger. So unlike the previous 2 studies, I do the quantitative studies. So first of all, I gather the data. The main data I'm using is from CDC, but the Behavioral Health Risk Factor Surveillance System. I used data year 2011 and cut before COVID, because COVID affects a lot on the mental health later on. And this is individual level survey data and cross-sectional with CBSA indicators. CBSA here is larger than county. You can imagine as a commuting zone. I used CBSA because CBSA was the only available, the smallest geographic identifier. And I picked 4. One is frequent distress. So do the individual experience bad mental health days within past 30 days, more than 14 days. So if they experience more than 14 bad mental health days, I make them as 1, and otherwise 0. And also they have an indicator for diagnosed depression. And in addition to that, I add binge drinking and the smoking as well. For the disaster data, I use 2 data sets. One is from FEMA. So they declare, oh, this is the big one. And then if they have a big one, I mark them as 1s. And Spatial Hazard Events and Loss Database, which is SHELDIS, I use this data because they have some magnitude of the disaster. So I use them to control for the magnitude. And this is my model. So this is 2-way fixed model, and this is very preliminary. So I have my mental health outcome, which is 1 or 0 for each individual. And X here is the control data, which includes individuals' income, gender, age, educational status, marital status, and those kind of demographic controls. And I also counted for the yearly fixed effect, which means I'm subtracting the yearly average of each database. And most important is the CBSA data, CBSA fixed effect, which means I'm looking within the CBSA, like within the certain geographic range. If they have a disaster, how does the mental health changes? So I'm looking for this one. And again, I was interested in the compound effect. I used another dummy variable, which is past, which equals to 1 if they experience a big one right before this year. And then I interacted them with the current disaster indicator, which means if the beta 1 is larger than 0, the past one affects severely on the second one. Does everything make sense? Yes. So this is my baseline result. So the black dot here is the baseline result. I didn't find a very significant result if I control for the everything. almost everything. But depression here increases a lot if there's no disaster in past 10 years. So this is regression. If there's no disaster in past 10 years, the depression increases a lot, but somehow smoking decreases. And I divided them by age, like 18 to 29, 13 to 44, 45 to 64, and over 65. We found that for older adults, the depression is a bit higher, but we have a pretty much differences between the behavior responses. If they have a disaster, the working age have an increase in binge drinking or smoking. But on the other hand, the older adults experience less smoking, but they're depressed. So yeah, that was one. And then another is a compound effect. So the black one here means they do not have severe disaster last year. Red one means they did have severe disaster last year. And then we found that the effects are slightly larger for the behavioral responses. So I found that repeated disaster associated with the more pronounced changes in mental health and behavioral outcomes. Also, effects are heterogeneous across age and income groups. I didn't show the income yet, but income groups, lower income group have more severe responses to the bad mental health. And next step, we try to address the endogenous concerns in a disaster declaration because sometimes FEMA works with a political issues. So if they're more blue state, they declare more to support them, like something like this. And we try to exploit the staggered timing of the disasters because the timing is all different to strengthen the causal claims. And we try to do more robustness checks and another alternative outcomes. Thank you.
Is your research finding, are you studying mainly like floods and hurricanes? Or are you looking at like, for example, the fires of California where
Mhm.
people lost everything, their homes, everything? A flood, your house may survive a flood or hurricane.
That's a good point. I didn't bring this. So this is overall. So this disaster includes all flood, hurricanes, and fire and snowstorms and everything. But if I divided them by the disaster type, the effects from fire is actually small. And hurricane is big. Flood is small as well. Something does that answer your question? Yeah. I think fire because the sample size itself is small. So that's one of the limitations. Any other questions? Rick?
This may be asking you to make a qualitative guess from quantitative data,
Mhm.
but have you thought about some of these the differences, divergences that you've seen? For instance, the behavioral responses that are different, more smoking among this group, less smoking among that. Are those things that your data can support some answers to?
That's a great question. So the assumption from me is older adults are more hard to move from their residence, so from their residential area, but younger adults actually can, right? So, and also the older adults may concern more about their health itself, and then they are actually more damaged as well. So at that time, if you think about the cohort example, I can actually look for the mortality data. So which age group died more, and if your age group died more, you might concern more about your health and then reduce the behavior. If they do not experience that much mortality, they might just be stressful and then do the coping mechanism here. So that's what I thought.
That's great, thank you.
Good.
Thank you very much. Are there any other burning questions and or any comments? No?
I have
No,
comments.
yeah. Frequent flyer.
Well, I want to just congratulate each of our presenters because they were so diverse in
Mhm.
the topics, but so thorough, and they got it across in 10 minutes, which is a miracle, I think.
Yeah.
That they could
Yeah.
explain this much in 10 minutes. So good job, excellent work, and the best to all three of you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
they did great. And as you know, and I think they would attest, their dissertations are probably 1,000 times bigger than they were able to tell you in 10